For years, Russia treated Italy like background noise, a country of ports, politics, and peacetime debate. Culturally huge, economically relevant, militarily secondary, the kind of NATO member that hosts assets, votes in meetings, and stays out of the spotlight. That assumption is now becoming dangerous because the shift that starts showing up by 2026 isn't Italy getting angry or Italy turning aggressive. It's worse for Moscow than that. Italy is becoming the place NATO can operate from without warning, sustain from without strain, and coordinate through without improvisation. And when that happens, Russia doesn't lose to a headline. Russia loses to timing. This story has a very specific shape. It starts with a familiar Russian method: pressure by presence, pressure by ambiguity. Small moves that feel routine until they're not. A ship here, a flight there, a diplomatic signal layered over a military gesture, all designed to test how long NATO takes to notice, agree, and respond. For most of the post-Cold War period, Russia's Mediterranean approach depended on one thing above all: fragmentation, different national priorities, slow coordination, political hesitation, a quiet belief inside Moscow that NATO's southern flank would always lag behind its northern and eastern edges. Italy fit neatly into that picture. It had capable forces, strong industry, and strategic geography, but limited urgency and limited appetite to turn geography into leverage. That was the comfort zone, but now that picture no longer holds. Public reporting through 2024 and 2025 shows Italy moving steadily towards something more structural: integration, endurance, and command relevance, rather than isolated national capability. Not a one-year spending spike, not a symbolic modernization cycle, a posture adjustment that makes Italy more central to how NATO functions in the Mediterranean. And here's the moment you need to hold on to, because it's the moment that changes the story. By 2026, this shift starts showing up operationally. Not in parades, not in speeches, in routine, in how quickly forces move, how long they stay, how seamlessly they plug into allied systems, and how little warning Russia gets before normal becomes ready. That matters because Russia's southern strategy doesn't collapse when it's confronted head-on. It collapses when the operating environment stops being permissive, when the same old probing behavior stops producing the same old delays, debates, and gaps. Italy is helping to tighten that environment. Geography explains why, and it's not subtle. Italy sits at the intersection of three critical spaces: the central Mediterranean, NATO's southern logistics routes, and the air and maritime corridors connecting Europe to North Africa and the Middle East. For Russia, that region has long been valuable precisely because it felt manageable. Russian naval deployments, air activity, and diplomatic signaling could operate in a space where NATO response timelines were assumed to be slower and coordination more politically complex. Italy's shift disrupts that assumption in the most uncomfortable way. Because by 2026, Italy is no longer just hosting allied forces. It is increasingly organizing, supporting, and sustaining them as part of a routine posture. And routine posture understanding is the difference between "will respond" and "we're already positioned." Russia's planners now have to consider that pressure applied in the Mediterranean may not sit in a holding pattern while NATO debates. Instead, it may hit an environment where surveillance is denser, logistics are already in place, and coordination is not improvised under stress. That compresses timelines. It narrows ambiguity, and it forces Russia to operate with less room to test reactions quietly. What makes this shift especially unpleasant for Moscow is that it doesn't hinge on one shiny Italian capability Russia can point to and counter. There is no single kill switch, no single base whose loss would undo the posture, no dramatic red line to probe. Instead, Italy is building structural relevance, a role that matters not because Italy wants confrontation, but because NATO increasingly relies on it to keep the southern operating space functional under pressure. Italy's defense policy documents and alliance reporting emphasize interoperability, readiness, and sustained contribution rather than short-term signaling. That is a different model of deterrence, one that doesn't try to scare an adversary, but quietly denies them comfortable reasonable assumptions. And for Russia, denial is often harder to deal with than overt hostility. Because deterrence is not just about firepower. It's about understanding what the other side will do, how long it will take, and how many gaps you can exploit before they get organized. Italy's transformation is making the Mediterranean less predictable for Moscow's planners, not by adding chaos, but by removing slack. Russian strategy has often relied on exploiting gaps between north and south, between political will and military readiness, between detection and response. Italy's emerging role starts closing those gaps. Not all at once, not dramatically, but persistently. So by 2026, Italy is no longer a passive southern anchor. It becomes an operational hinge, a country that connects surveillance, logistics, airspace control, and command structures into a more coherent system. Russia doesn't need Italy to become aggressive for this to matter. All Italy has to do is make the southern flank less forgiving. That's already happening. And here's the thing to anticipate, because it's where the pressure strategy starts breaking first. The first place this shift becomes impossible to ignore isn't at sea, it's overhead. If Russia's Mediterranean strategy depends on anything, it depends on airspace, not dominance, access. The ability to move aircraft, gather intelligence, signal presence, rotate forces, and support naval activity without every flight becoming a political or operational event. For years, that access rested on an assumption. NATO's southern air picture would remain fragmented, slower to react, and heavily dependent on a small number of lead nations. That meant Russia could fly, probe, posture, and watch for reactions without every movement being immediately folded into a shared, coherent picture. Italy is quietly breaking that assumption. By 2026, Italy's air power is no longer just about defending national airspace. It is becoming a coordination layer, a place where detection, decision, and direction converge faster than Russia is comfortable with. And the difference shows up the moment pressure starts building. For much of the 2000s and 2010s, the Italian Air Force was capable but conservative in posture. Well-trained crews, modern platforms, strong NATO ties, but largely oriented toward rotational missions and national commitments rather than sustained, high-tempo alliance operations in the Mediterranean. That model is changing. Public NATO exercise reporting and Italian defense planning show a shift toward persistent readiness, integrated air defense, and continuous interoperability rather than episodic participation. Italy is not trying to outgun anyone. It is positioning itself so Allied air operations can flow through its airspace smoothly, quickly, and repeatedly. That matters because air power sets the pace for everything else. When airspace is permissive, naval movements are easier, logistics are safer, surveillance is steadier. When airspace becomes crowded, watched, and responsive, every other domain slows down. Russia understands this. It has exploited permissive air environments repeatedly, using flights and patrols to test reactions, shape narratives, and apply pressure without crossing formal red lines. Italy's 2026 posture makes that harder, and it does it in three ways. The first is integration. Italian air operations are increasingly structured around shared NATO air pictures, data links, and command systems that make detection and classification faster and less ambiguous. That means Russian aircraft operating in or near the Mediterranean are less likely to be seen by one radar, one nation, or one decision maker. They are seen by a system, and systems don't argue about whether something looks routine for very long. The second shift is endurance. Russia's air signaling often assumes the other side will surge briefly and then pull back, either because of political sensitivity, resource strain, or operational fatigue. Italy is building a posture designed to stay present without burning out. Routine air policing, regular Allied integration, sustained sortie generation rather than symbolic bursts. By 2026, Italy's air power isn't optimized for dramatic escalation. It's optimized for not blinking. That's a problem for a pressure strategy built on waiting the other side out. The third shift is air defense behavior, not just air defense hardware. Italy's layered air defense posture, increasingly integrated with Allied sensors and command frameworks, changes how aircraft must operate even when no interceptors are launched. When detection is reliable and cueing is fast, aircraft are forced to fly higher, farther, and more predictably. That raises costs, it reduces flexibility, and it makes signaling louder and less subtle. Air defenses don't have to fire to shape the battle space, they just have to exist credibly. So for Russia, operating near an Italian-centered air network means fewer comfortable corridors and fewer ambiguous movements that can be dismissed as normal. There is also a signaling effect Russia cannot ignore. Air patrols are supposed to communicate confidence without escalation, but signaling only works when it goes uncontested. A more active, integrated Italian air posture creates constant counter-presence, not confrontational, unavoidable, and that counter-presence doesn't stand alone. Italian airspace increasingly acts as a gateway for Allied operations, surveillance flights, refueling tracks, rotational deployments, and rapid reinforcement. When those pathways are already active and coordinated, Russia loses the advantage of surprise and tempo. Here's the first major 2026 flip. By 2026, Italy's air power doesn't just respond. It absorbs pressure without changing posture. That is deeply uncomfortable for Moscow, because Russia's coercive signaling relies on visible reaction. Scrambles, emergency meetings, temporary surges. When the posture barely shifts because it was already integrated and ready, the signal loses its leverage. Nothing dramatic happens. Nothing escalates. But the pressure doesn't work, and that is often worse than confrontation. Italy's role in the air is not about dominating the Mediterranean. It's about making the airspace behave like managed terrain rather than open sky. More eyes, faster decisions, fewer blind spots, less time to test boundaries quietly. And air power, as always, sets the terms for what happens next. Because once airspace stops being permissive, naval operations stop being comfortable. And that's where Italy's growing role becomes even harder for Russia to work around. If airspace sets the pace, the sea decides whether pressure can be sustained at all. And by 2026, Italy is turning the central Mediterranean from a signaling zone into a management problem for Russia. Not a battlefield, not a blockade, a problem of access, tempo, and endurance. For years, Russia's Mediterranean posture relied on a simple reality. The sea was busy, politically sensitive, and operationally fragmented. That made it ideal for pressure by presence. Naval deployments could look routine. Logistics could blend in. Movements could be explained away as rotation, resupply, or visibility missions rather than deliberate signaling. Italy is quietly eroding that comfort. And here's the moment to watch for as you listen through this section. Russia's model depends on being able to show up and make the other side feel uncertain. It depends on presence doing psychological work. Italy's shift makes presence measurable. The shift is not about matching Russia ship for ship. It's about shaping how the sea behaves once pressure starts to build. Italy sits at the hinge of the Mediterranean. Routes between east and west, north and south, NATO and non-NATO traffic all pass through spaces where Italian naval, air, and logistics infrastructure already plays a central role. For a long time, that role was treated as background support. By 2026, it becomes foreground control. Italian naval modernization and posture changes are increasingly focused on three things Russia dislikes operating against at sea: persistent awareness, operational coordination, and sustainment depth. The first is awareness. Modern naval power is not about what you can sink, it's about what you can track. Russia's surface ships and submarines rely on patterns, predictability, and the assumption that not every movement will be continuously monitored. Italy's role in maritime surveillance, through surface vessels, maritime patrol aircraft, and integration with Allied sensor networks, reduces that assumption. Movement becomes data, patterns become visible. Routine deployments start to look less routine when they're logged, compared, and shared. This doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't require escalation. It just removes comfort. The second shift is coordination. Italian naval assets are increasingly designed designed to operate as part of a shared maritime picture, not as isolated national patrols. That means a contact track by Italy doesn't stay Italian. It feeds a wider NATO operating picture that includes air, surface, and undersea awareness. That collapses ambiguity. A Russian vessel lingering near a corridor is no longer just noticed. It's contextualized compared to past behavior, flagged for deviation, quietly factored into Allied planning. When that happens consistently, signaling loses its edge. Russia's naval pressure model relies on the idea that presence alone reshapes behavior, but presence only works when it creates uncertainty on the other side. When the response becomes routine, measured, and already integrated, the presence stops doing psychological work. The third and most important shift is endurance. Russia has been effective at using naval deployments because it assumes the other side pays a higher cost to stay ready. Fuel, crew tempo, political attention, logistics strain. The expectation is that pressure campaigns exhaust targets faster than they exhaust Moscow. Italy is positioning itself to flip that assumption. By 2026, Italy's naval role is less about dramatic deployments and more about keeping the lights on. Ports that can host Allied ships repeatedly, maintenance and logistics hubs that reduce turnaround time, crews trained for sustained presence rather than one-off surges. Endurance doesn't look impressive on paper, but it kills pressure strategies quietly. When presence becomes baseline instead of reactive, Russia loses the ability to escalate simply by showing up. The hallway gets crowded, the maneuver space narrows, and every additional deployment yields diminishing returns. Here's the second major 2026 flip. The Mediterranean stops being a space where Russia can apply pressure gradually and becomes a space where pressure shows up already measured, already contextualized, and already answered quietly. Nothing explodes, nothing spikes dramatically, but the signal doesn't land. And there's another layer Russia finds even more uncomfortable. Italy's naval role is inseparable from Italy's logistics role. Ships don't operate in isolation. They depend on ports, maintenance, fuel, resupply, and protected routes. Italy's infrastructure allows NATO forces to rotate, replenish, and remain present without dramatic buildup phases. That means pressure does not force withdrawal. It forces normalization. And normalization is the enemy of coercion. Russia can still deploy. It can still patrol. It can still signal. But the environment no longer reacts the way it used to. The sea becomes managed rather than contested. Movements become visible rather than symbolic. Presence becomes background noise instead of leverage. Italy doesn't close the Mediterranean. It makes it less usable as a pressure tool. And when naval pressure loses efficiency, Russia looks for leverage elsewhere. That's where the real complication begins because the Mediterranean doesn't stay isolated. Here's the problem Russia keeps running into, and by 2026, Italy makes it worse. Russia prefers compartments. Pressure here, calm there, noise in one theater, silence in another. That separation isn't accidental. It's how Moscow manages risk while still probing. If pressure stays local, Russia can test, signal, and pull back without triggering a wider reaction. Italy's 2026 posture quietly breaks that model, not by confronting Russia head-on, but by connecting the spaces Russia wants kept separate. Because once Italy's role fully locks in, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and NATO's southern flank stop behaving like isolated maps. A move in one area doesn't stay contained. It shows up elsewhere, faster than Russia wants. And that's the point of no return. When theaters connect, Russia loses its favorite advantage: tempo. Italy sits at the junction of NATO logistics, air routes, naval movement, and coordination. For years, that position was treated as support, useful, not decisive. By 2026, it becomes leverage. A naval move tied to Syria affects posture across the central Mediterranean. Pressure near the Black Sea reshapes surveillance and readiness farther west. The more connected the environment becomes, the harder it is for Russia to keep actions compartmentalized. Italy accelerates that connection. By 2026, developments are less likely to be interpreted in isolation. They're folded into a wider pattern early, before Russia can stretch ambiguity into advantage. And that's where Russia's escalation model starts to fail, because Russia's leverage depends on time gaps. Time between detection and interpretation, interpretation and coordination, coordination and response. Italy compresses those gaps, not with dramatic moves, but with routine alignment. Bases, ports, and airfields don't just host forces. They enable rotation, reinforcement, sustainment. Pressure doesn't create hesitation, it triggers readiness. Quiet readiness. And quiet readiness is poison for strategy built on ambiguity. Here's the critical 2026 flip. By 2026, Russia can't assume Mediterranean pressure stays a Mediterranean problem. It bleeds into alliance-wide planning early, making escalation harder to localize and harder to control. And control of tempo is where Russia's real leverage lives. Russia's pressure campaigns are designed to exhaust targets before unity forms. They rely on the idea that sustained readiness is costly and hard to maintain. Italy undermines that assumption by contributing endurance instead of spikes, steady availability instead of symbolic surges. When endurance becomes baseline, pressure stops accumulating. Russia can still signal, but the signal stops changing behavior because the counter posture is already there. Italy doesn't need spectacle to matter. By 2026, Italy becomes a problem for Russia for one reason. It attacks the one advantage Moscow depends on most: time.